Okay, hopefully we're coming back up here. All right, I think we're back. Okay, so regular for just the citywide facts for the wages and benefits. Had a little change here in training. He just wanted to move some money from EMS to fire. It's how he tracks it. Office supplies, just increased that about $300. The doctor was increased there, that assessment, and we needed to increase that by $2,000. We did have one little change here, and I forgot to highlight this $7,000. So up above that agreement we have with the county to pay for some of the heavy rescue costs. One of the things associated with that is we pay for the operation and maintenance of the heavy rescue, so it can go for like fuel and tires and repairs and things like that. So we need to track that separate. So I've changed this account number now, so it's heavy rescue 41 operation and maintenance, and that's what that $7,000 is associated with, just so we can report to the county if they ever ask us what we spent that money on and how much we've been spending on the heavy rescue. And other than that, the only other changes he had were just with the internal service fund allocations. If you remember, we've already budgeted for his new ambulance, even though we just recently got that, and so it's already built into those allocations. So that's the fire. Community. Oh, and one other thing to mention on the fire. One thing we might do, or we will probably do, is we'll bring you an amendment like we usually do for this current fiscal year. And we had budgeted to pay for those repairs to his engine 42, his backup out of the motor pool. We'd like to pay for that out of the general fund. With sales tax being a little higher, we have a little extra money there. We'd like to just pay for them out of the current year, and then we don't have to worry about reimbursing the internal service fund for that. So that is something that you'll see here coming up in the next 6 weeks. With community development, not a lot of changes there. We've got the citywide facts for budget and wages. They increased their equipment budget by about $200 to be $1,200. Professional services, one of the things with a lot of these buildings, especially some of the proposed projects to the south of us, our building inspector, Jeff Woody, he has a hard time he can keep up with our current volume, but if we have some big projects, it gets hard to do that and to stay on top of everything. And so we increased the budget here about $10,000. This should really kind of be offset by the plan fees that come in and the building permits, but it gives him some flexibility if he gets a lot coming in that he can have somebody outside help him. We utilize an outside engineering firm that can help him review plans or do inspections if he needs it. And so that's what that increase is associated with. Mike pulled his miscellaneous budget down about $1,000 to be $4,000, and then we just have the internal service fund allocations. So that's community development. Streets. We have a little more going on in streets this year. So we have our citywide facts for budget for benefits and wages. Sean had some increases here with equipment and maintenance, just various things. Fuel, he pulled down just a tiny bit. Street lights, he increased the maintenance there. Once we get down here, this is where it gets a little more interesting, I guess. So this is what we're projected that will roll over on Class C road funds. Would have about $422,000, and then $958,000 a local option. Now with the CMAC grant on 1050 West, we created a new account here, 1050 West Roundabout Project, so that we can track that, so that we can start allocating, because we've had costs associated with engineering and property purchases and those kind of things. So we want to be able to track that. So we separated that out. If you remember, up above, we'll get $500,000 of revenue from the federal CMAQ funds. And then we have to provide at least $100,000 match, if not more. And so that $100,000 will come out of our local option. So really we have like $1,058,000 that we're rolling over, but I've included $100,000 of it down here in the 1050 West roundabout projects. If we go over the $600,000, if it costs more than that, then we'll just utilize some of this other local option money and spend it down here. But that's so we can complete that project. We do have one small increase here in this special department expenses of about $500. And then we just have our internal service fund allocations. If you look, this line item goes up quite a bit for the motor pool. And if you remember when back in February, and we'll talk about this in a minute, they need to replace one of their big Freightliner snowplow and dump trucks. And so that's $250,000. And so that's why that reimbursement went up so much. And then just a small decrease in equipment rental. They haven't needed to rent as much equipment, so we just pulled that down a little bit. So that's streets.
Cody?
Yep.
Yeah, can you, would curb and gutter replacement, does it fall under the street category?
I believe that's usually where we pay for that. It kind of depends. Some of that can qualify, I believe, for stormwater, depending on what it is. And so it kind of depends on the project. And I believe Sean works with our engineer, Scott Nelson, to determine where that allocation should be taken from, depending on the project, if it qualifies for stormwater or
Can I
if it comes out of the
deviate
straits.
Just briefly?
Mm-hmm.
Now, 3 years ago when I was walking campaigning, on the south side specifically, there was a whole lot of curb and gutter replacement going on. And I was told that it was being primarily paid for at that time by that sales tax increase that was voted on for streets and
That's this local option road expenditures.
Okay, so now in the interim, in the last year or two, I briefly visited with Mr. Douglas or communicated with him. Are we still doing those replacements? Because I've been approached about, literally somebody said the people across the street, that whole street got their curb and gutter replaced, and then it stopped and there hasn't been anything for a couple of years. Is that being allocated? Are we still budgeting that? And if so, where would that be?
Well, you can see right here, there's a couple notes. We do have like a sidewalk additions of 20,000 and sidewalk maintenance of 25,000. I think they just look at a couple things. One, like where they're doing projects, and then two, where the biggest needs are. And then that's how they've been deciding which projects to do next.
And also, I was told that if somebody wants to do it, they can. The resident can pay half, and the city will pay half. And I don't. Anyway, I just thought that was a little odd. But anyway, maybe this is a offline for what you're trying to accomplish. Maybe Mr. Douglas can expound a little bit. Maybe now, maybe at another time. That's fine.
So currently what we do with most of the curb and gutter replacements is when we're doing our road overlay project, if there's a safety hazard or if there's a curb and gutter that holds more than 3/4 of an inch of water, we do that at the time that we're doing the road project. And with the road projects we have been doing a lot of curb and gutter with them. So we haven't been going out and doing projects that are just curb and gutter only. And then again this year, the cul-de-sacs that we're doing that, they're going to have a lot of curb and gutter in them. So we will, we'll be doing a lot of replacement there. We won't be going out looking for individual projects. And we do always, if we have money available, we're willing to work with a resident that has a specific problem on a 50-50 basis, usually as long as there's money available for that.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, maybe that's something we can talk more in depth at a future time to see if that isn't a priority or not. Okay, thank you.
All right. I know the schedule they've had in the past seemed to work pretty well. There are occasions when, like Sean mentioned, sometimes somebody's got a real bad gutter or something. It's crumbling, and they try to go in early and fix it. But usually it's when they replace the road, then they go in, they do the handicap access points in the intersections. They modify those if they haven't, and do that, like you said, the curb and gutters and things like that. And he's got a schedule lined out that he does it. But,
okay. Then, I'll refer the people that approached me to Mr. Douglas for the timeline for that schedule then. Thank you.
Okay. That's probably the best thing to do, Bart. So. Plus, there are some things the city will pay half and the resident pays half. And Sean and Norm Farrell, they could probably explain those things to them. So.
Yeah, and again, 3.5 years ago, the city was doing all of it, like over by Golden Spike Park. It did one side of the street, then haven't done anything since. And I explained the half, 50%, and they said, well, they got it for nothing. Why do I have to pay? Anyway, you get it. Never mind. I'm belaboring it.
Okay.
Any other questions on streets before I keep going? If you keep in mind, this was one of the departments that went up quite a bit. So you can see we go up about 600,000 in this department, but 500,000 of it is that CMAQ money that we didn't have last year. And then we rolled over about $100,000 of Class C road money that we didn't in the prior year. So that's almost entirely the increase in this department is those two things. So that's streets. Next up is parks. So once again, the citywide facts for wages and benefits. A small increase here for equipment maintenance. That's just what Sean and Norm thought they needed. One of the biggest changes in parks is the fertilizer and weed control. They'd like to increase the budget from $6,000 to $9,000, and this is so they can fertilize twice a year. They're hoping to just keep the parks in a little better shape if they can fertilize a little more often. Ramp grant expenditures. We have a little bit more money there that we rolled over, and so that's an increase. We just estimate what projects we've utilized that money for and what we have available. If you remember, we get $1 for each resident that we have of that population grant money, so we get like $8,600 to $8,900 a year right now of that population money. The internal service fund allocations, and then capital outlays. You can see the budget notes. That's for fiber, tree removal, playground parts, an aerator, and then a smaller aerator just to split between the parks and the RDA for this senior housing facility for those smaller parcels. So that's everything within parks. Community services, Rich's department. We have a few more changes in Rich's department. Most of them are just kind of incremental changes as well. We've got the citywide facts here. A small change there to subscriptions and memberships as they increase. He increased travel and training by about $900, pulled the office supplies down about $2, increased or decreased equipment maintenance by about $10,000. They haven't been using as much of that. If you remember historically, I think that's where we paid for some of our furnaces, and we're doing that a little different now. Programs, he pulled that down about $250, just a little less needs there. Senior lunches, where we're going to increase the cost there, and we have some additional costs associated with like dishwashing and those things that haven't been allocated to the lunch program before. We increased this budget line item to offset by the increase in the cost so that we could pay for those items. Another thing that we've done is we've spent a lot of money, if you remember, about a year ago to redo the senior center. And so one of the things that like the carpet layers recommended to us is that we clean that carpet annually. And historically, we haven't done anything there at that facility on an annual basis. And if you remember at the community center, Rich usually shuts down for a week, usually around the 24th of July, to do a lot of maintenance on his facility. So we'd like to start doing the same thing at the senior center, trying to keep it in a little better shape and make that carpet last as long as possible. So we budgeted $5,000 to clean the carpets and do some deep cleaning and those kind of things. And that will be at Rich and Miranda's discretion when they want to do that, but they'll probably take a week and kind of shut down that facility and get it spruced up so it stays and lasts a little better. Soccer, we pulled that down $1,000. Rich didn't think he needed quite as much stuff for soccer. Same thing, intramurals increased $500. This contract class expenditures, this is the offset for those revenues up above. We should actually make money on those recreation programs because we charge a fee. The contractor takes a little bit, and then the city gets any other remaining. So we should actually make a little money on those. Baseball and softball, he pulled down just a little bit. Flag football, he decreased about $1,000, and the youth committee, he decreased $200. We haven't had as many people taking advantage of the Roy Aquatic Center and Complex, so this won't affect the number of swim nights we have, but where they haven't been utilizing as much, we just pulled that down $2,000. If you remember, this used to be buried in the miscellaneous, and we separated it. So when we separated it, we just kind of guessed how much we needed, and that's been decreasing a little bit. And then we have the internal service fund allocations. So in total, that is the general fund. So you can see we go up, but most of those increases are associated with that federal funding that we have, and then with some rollovers. So our actual increases, I think when I figured it out, was about $250,000 between all the departments, excluding that federal funding. So that's the general fund. If nobody has any questions, and our YouTube's still working, it looks like, I'm just going to keep right on going unless somebody wants to stop me. So we have on the schedule that we'll cover water next. So we'll skip over the Rda funds here for just a second, and we'll go back. Okay, so this year, that almost all of our, as Sean and I started working on the enterprise funds, when we started calling people, almost all of them told us that this year they're not doing any increases or very minimal increases, but then to plan on an increase next year. So you'll notice on every fund, I have a little note here, no fee increase for fiscal year 2022. However, plan on one for fiscal year 2023. I'll talk about that in more detail as we go and throughout this, but for the most part, we do not have any fee increases this year, but we probably need to plan on them for next year. So I pulled up our water just a little bit. We've been averaging higher with the dry year. So I increased that budget amount, pulled the interest down just like I did in the general fund. We've actually, if you remember, we have some of those late fees now. We've been averaging quite a bit higher, and so I increased the budget associated with those line items. With expenditures in the water fund, we have the citywide facts associated with benefits and wages. The biggest charge, if you remember, in the water fund is associated with Weber Basin. And part of the reason we haven't done a fee increase is we're still waiting on that point of diversion application to the state. From talking to Sean and Weber Basin, we're almost to the point now that the state should review that and give us our answer, which hopefully will be in the affirmative. And then at that point, we'll kind of have a better idea what Weber Basin charges will be. If you remember, we're trying to move the water that we have in some of the canals and those kind of shares to a different point of diversion so that Weber Basin can provide it to us as treated water. And so that helps us long term because it saves us about $400 or $500 a share per acre feet to do that rather than to buy additional water from Weber Basin. And so that's why we don't have a fee increase. But Weber Basin, they're mandated by the state to increase their rates for capital projects and things. And this year they decided to not have as big or to not have an increase, I believe, at all. But then next year they'll probably catch up for it. And so we've usually passed that rate percentage increase on to the residents. So that's why we don't have a fee increase this year. Sean wanted to increase the power for pumping associated with the well. We've just been usually averaging a little closer to 90 than 85,000. Special testing, we always have to do a little more testing every year, so we increased that $300. Increased engineering about $10,000. That's associated with some of the studies we're doing, and also with the growth that we're seeing or potential growth coming. Special department expenses, you can see it increased by about $6,900. We have some budget notes there for some of those things, like a well inspection for $1,000, water meters for $7,500, state fees $2,500, well rectifier $2,500, hydrants $3,500, locator $6,000, and some miscellaneous tools for $1,000. Our depreciation, if you remember in the enterprise funds, we have to budget for them on the full accrual basis of accounting. Our depreciation expense has been low, and so we just increased our budget there. Our internal service fund allocation here, and then capital projects got cut off on the next page, but we're budgeting $60,000 for SCADA upgrades, $7,000 for emergency trailer, $500,000 for a water line replacement. And then this last item, a lot of the cities and some of the districts around us, there's some programs right now, like North Ogden and Far West have been taking advantage of one with a truck buyback program where they can actually, I think North Ogden, they bought trucks, and I can't remember from what dealership, and then they bought them outright, and then they signed a lease or an agreement that within a year they could sell the truck back at the city's option. They could keep it if they wanted to, or they could try and sell it for more, but that they could sell it back actually for the exact same purchase price that they had. And there's a mileage limit and a couple things associated with it, but they could basically get a truck, use it for a year, not have any costs associated with tires or maintenance or those kind of things, and then sell it. And so we wanted to try that with 2 trucks. And the reason we put it in here, and I think there's one in Stormwater too, is we don't really know what cost to allocate to the motor pool. And so we thought it was easier, especially this first year as we're starting to try that program, just to allocate the cost out of the water fund. And then once we sell that truck, would just put the revenue back in there. And then hopefully would know that each year it costs us about $1,000 or whatever the case may be. So that's the capital projects within the water fund. And then we have a line item. We've been budgeting, if you remember the last couple of years, some money. So if water shares come available, that we have money to buy those. There haven't been very many available. And so Sean decided to pull that budget down by about $50,000. And so in total, that's the expenditures on the water fund. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, I'll keep plugging away. So the sewer fund, same thing. We got a very small increase. Thank you. Thanks. We got a very small increase from Central Weber, but they told us, and the mayor can probably speak more to this, they've incurred some additional costs or getting ready to do some more projects. And so they're anticipating that next year they'll have about a 10% increase in their fee structure. And so we don't have a fee increase this year, but it sounds like next year we'll have a bigger one. If you remember right, usually they send their fees based out not only on, they do a 50-50 split on assessed value and growth. And so usually our portion hasn't been the full 10%. But we probably will have an increase in our Central Weber assessment next year. Within the sewer fund, I pulled the interest revenue down, and just with interest doing what it is. And then sewer connection fees, we've had more connection fees, so I increased the sewer connection fee revenue. As far as expenditure goes, we have our citywide facts there for wages and benefits. Central Weber sewer, the main increase was associated with their pre-treatment, so we pulled that up slightly to cover that. And then they are on a calendar year, so sometimes their increases hit us mid-year, but we don't know what they are. So that's why we increased their main Central Weber account by $10,000 just to make sure we had enough to get us by until we could potentially look at it next year. Building and grounds, they increased $1,000. Engineering, they pulled down $5,000. If you remember, in the current year, well, actually 2 years ago before COVID hit, we were trying to do a sewer study. And so that's part of the reason that was higher. So we pulled that back down a little bit. And then we have the citywide facts for the internal service fund down here at the bottom. For capital projects, we were budgeting $300,000 for sewer line replacement and $7,000 for an emergency trailer. So that's the sewer fund. Next up's the Stormwater Fund. If you remember, we've been telling you that we'll have a fee increase sometime for the Stormwater Fund. I don't think we've had a fee increase since the Stormwater Fund was implemented. So at some point we'll need to do that. So next year might be the year. We pulled the interest revenues down, so the total revenues for the Stormwater Fund will be $244,500. Stormwater expenses, we have the citywide facts there for budget and wages. Once again, depreciation was exceeding my estimate a little bit, so I pulled that up. We have our internal service fund allocations, and then for capital outlay, we've budgeted $250,000 for stormwater improvements, $15,000 for manhole collars, $7,000 for an emergency trailer, and then $50,000 for that truck buyback program. And that is the sewer fund. Stormwater fund. For garbage, Sean talked to our hauler. He would like to do an increase, but he said he could wait till next year. And I talked to John Watson who manages the transfer station, and he said that the county won't have an increase until 2022. And so once again, we don't have an increase in the garbage or recycling. We've just held that flat. We pulled the interest down, so total budgeted revenues are $397,500. For the expenses within the garbage fund, we have our citywide facts there. We have a small increase in emergency management of $1,000. And then right now we don't have any internal service fund cost allocations. And so that's the total for that fund. And if you remember, we do show a little bit of a loss here. We usually end up less than that because of how we budget, and we really just want the garbage fund to break even because we really don't have anything to pay for there, and we can only use that money for garbage. And so it's one of the enterprise funds that we want to profit, but we want it pretty small. And so that's the garbage fund. Next on our list, we have the capital projects fund. So unless anybody has any questions, we'll go back here just a little bit. So in the capital projects fund for revenue, we have that budgeted transfer just for our surplus fund balance, if we have any, of $1.2 million. We're budgeting to use fund balance of $1 million or $196,500, and then we have our interest allocation that we pulled down of $39,500. For projects within the capital projects fund, most of these are what we talked about in February. We kept $15,000 in here for the Civic Center. This is just for miscellaneous repairs such as furnaces and things as this building gets older. Scott would like to do a remodel at his building, at least he thinks he does, for $150,000. And then Jared would like to do some fire station improvements at $40,000. The senior housing facilities, we're trying to separate those a little bit more. We have some appliances that are getting old. I believe they were used when they were installed in the facility. I think coming up on 16 years now ago, and so they're just getting old, and we have some repairs associated with them. So trying to separate Fund 30 from senior center type activities, we budgeted $10,000 for appliance replacement in the capital projects fund. We left a little bit of money associated with geological hillside movements, just in case. I know that lawsuit's ended, but in case we had to move fences or whatever the case may be, just so we have a little money available there. Our Wi-Fi tower or communication tower, it's now complete. We're potentially working on maybe a little bit of a lease agreement with that, so we've left a little bit of money there in the budget in case we had some costs incurred associated with that. So in total, that's the capital projects fund. If no questions, next up is the internal service fund. So we have two of those. We have the motor pool. And so if you remember, the motor pool basically buys most of the vehicles and then leases them to the funds or departments that utilize those vehicles. So this year we're budgeting $383,688. That increase is associated mainly with that expensive Freightliner truck we'll buy on streets. We pulled the allocation of interest down slightly. So that's all the revenues in that fund. With the expenses, most of those stayed flat. Our main changes, once again, the depreciation wasn't quite enough as we get more vehicles, so I increased that. And then we have our current capital equipment purchases. These are what we talked about in February. So parks needed a truck and a lawnmower. Sewer needed one truck. And then we have that Freightliner in Streets, originally we had talked to you about paying for the water truck and the stormwater truck out of here too, but we ended up moving those to those funds so we could try that buyback program. So that's everything.
Cody, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Nope, you're just fine.
I had a quick question about the existing dump truck. And Sean, if you're on here, maybe you'd be the better person to answer this. Are we expecting to get any revenue from the sale of the existing truck at all?
We will. I think last time we sold one of those, it's been like 5 years ago, and I can't remember what we got. I think we got like $8,000 or something out of that. So that goes back into this motor pool. So that's what this $10,000 would potentially be made up of, is the sale of those vehicles that we're replacing. A lot of times we have no idea what we're going to sell them. I think the last time we sold one of those big trucks, we ended up having a problem with it, or the guy alleged we had a problem. Anyways, that's what that is this 10,000.
Thank you.
So the next fund is our internal service fund for IT. So once again, this is the calculation for support. As we do, Office 365 had a small increase, and then we just had more computers this year, so that's why that increased slightly. Interest we pulled down, and then we budgeted a contribution for retained earnings for some of the expenditures. Within the expenses associated with the IT fund, we increased the support and maintenance by about $15,000. There's a possibility that we might buy a couple new softwares, and so we wanted some money there if we decided to go ahead with those purchases. That's still kind of in the research department, but we wanted to put that in there just in case we needed it. Office 365 licenses went up just a little bit, so we increased that budget by about $2,000. Once again, my depreciation was a little low, so I pulled that number up. And then this $45,000 for equipment, a lot of that's just various equipment, and we try not to spend that, but it's there just in case we need it. And like I said, I didn't post those budget amendments here, so we were comparable. But the reason we look so far over budget is we bought those servers already, and we had to pay part of that. So we have a budget amendment here that will equal that purchase out. And that's the internal service funds, unless anybody has any questions. Okay, we're going to back up now a little bit and go to the RDA funds. So with the RDA funds, a lot of those will stay pretty similar, but we do have a couple changes. So our first RDA fund is Fund 21. That is our general RDA fund. So that's kind of the catch-all. That's where we do some of the general RDA type activities. So we're able to allocate the interest from the other RDA funds to this fund. And so we pulled that interest down slightly. We have a small use of fund balance of $77.50. And then we were able to transfer part of the property taxes from the 550 West RDA area to help fund these general operations. So that's the revenues for the general RDA fund. As far as expenditures go, most of those are the same. We budgeted that sewer study, and now we're just in the process of wrapping that up, but we left a little extra money in there in case we needed to do more, or if those invoices and things rolled over to next year. And that is the RDA fund. So in total, you can see we pulled the expenses down slightly to be $43,750. The next RDA fund is Riverdale Road. And if you remember, it's expired, so we're not getting any new property tax revenue into that fund, but we do have a fund balance. Part of that is what you're using to pay for some of the projects over there that Mike talked to about in the city council meeting associated with Cafe Rio and those things. So we did put in the budget $150,000 of use of fund balance, and then we have some money in here for improvements. It is possible, we'll have to see timing wise, we might end up rolling over some of that money associated with that development if we don't get to the point that we pay that funding out. So you might see that as a change between now and the final budget. That is the Riverdale Road RDA Fund. 1050 West, this is the big one that changed this year. So you can see we were collecting quite a bit of money in this fund, and now we're done. We haven't collected, as of the end of the year, that RDA area has expired, and we won't collect any more funding there. So we'll talk about that more in just a second with Fund 30, because that's where we are transferring that. We're not using this RDA fund at the moment, or the Weaver River. So we'll scroll through those. The 550 West RDA fund, if I remember right, that expires in tax year 2023. So we have a couple more years with that tax increment. We do transfer part of that increment to the 550 West. We're budgeting a little bit of a use of fund balance in that fund. And then for expenditures associated with that, sorry, hold on. My other computer just locked me out. Hold on. So we've got some money there for our increment payment associated with Riverdale Center 4, and I believe Mike's working on the calculation for that in the current year, so you'll see that coming. We have some money there, and we budget a little money for improvements, just like we have. So that's the 550 West RDA area. The West Bench, we haven't triggered it yet, so we don't have any budget associated with it at this point. The Statutory Housing Fund, we pulled the interest down slightly just with everything that's going on. And that's it stayed really consistent with the prior year. The expenditures, the only change there is with the interest going down, the increase in reserves decreased to $34,400. So that's the statutory housing. We have a few more changes. This is the housing RDA fund. This is where the housing, like the RDA loans, are housed. We pulled the interest down slightly to be $6,000. We're budgeting to use more of the fund balance, $30,500. That fund balance will go towards a couple things. One, if you remember, I believe we've talked to you about this. When Steve and I met with Larry Hansen right after Roger had passed away to talk to him about the RDA program, one of the things that Steve and I had talked about before the meeting, and then Larry confirmed, is that a lot of those loan documents are quite old and probably need to be updated. And so we budgeted some money here, so if we needed to go out to a third party and have them either do those loan documents for us or pay them one time to update it. And then the other thing, our software that we use to track those loans is getting quite old, and we're worried won't be supported anymore. And so if we need to replace that software, we wanted a little money available. And so that's these increases that we have going from $5,000 to $10,000 in professional services, and this miscellaneous account going from $5,000 to $25,000. So total expenditures we have increasing to $40,000. So that's the housing RDA fund. So the last one is our senior facility fund. If you can see right here, normally we've been collecting somewhere between $230,000 and $250,000 a tax increment. So we use that, if you remember, to pay for the debt service, the bonding associated with that facility. And then if you remember, a couple of years ago, we had Lewis Young, Roberts Birmingham do a study for us, and they told us that we could continue to use those funds to support the senior center. And so we talked to the mayor and council about that, and you guys voted to continue to do that. Well, now that funding, so we use that funding to support that and kind of save it for future repairs as well. Well, now that that's gone away and we won't collect any, we looked at some of the things associated with that facility, and it's not perfect, but trying to get it so that it sustains itself. If you remember, we've been trying to do rent increases incrementally. And so it's been 2 years since we did the last rent increase, and we aren't fully funding that facility. So we would propose doing a 5% rent increase. That's the increase here in rent revenues from 150,075 to 157,500. Right here, you can see the current rental rate. So right now, for a one bedroom, we're paying 500, or they're being charged 557,000 or $557. So a 5% increase would be about $28 a month. The new rate would be $585. For a two bedroom, it's currently $729. A 5% increase would be $37 a month. So we'd be at $766. If you remember, we have I can't remember exactly, but 250 people waiting to get into that facility. And so we felt like we could easily do a 5% rent increase and help cover some of those additional costs we have as that facility continues to age. That rent increase actually just kind of increases the decrease in interest revenues that we're getting with the economy being like it is. And then you can see we're budgeting. In the past, we haven't had to budget to use any fund balance each year because we've had the property tax to offset it. But this year we're having to budget $123,500 for some of the projects that we'll talk about here in just 1 minute. So expenses associated with the senior housing facility, most of these remained pretty flat. And some things are really hard to separate from the senior center and the senior housing, such as the utilities. It's not like we can say, this power, we get a power bill for the common areas. It's hard to know which of that is associated with the kitchen or the hallways where the residents live. And so most of those costs are still allocated here. But the biggest change, we did increase the capital costs to be $85,000. If you remember back in February, we talked to you about updating the landscaping over there. It's just getting 15 or 16 years old, and it's getting harder to maintain, and it kind of looks poor. And so we had budgeted $50,000 for landscaping upgrades over there. And then the rest of that is associated just with things that potentially could go wrong over there. We have 3, they're considered water heaters, but they're the biggest water heater you can get. The last one that went out a couple of years ago cost the city the RDA about $5,000 to replace. We've only replaced one of those, and we have 2. And then we have a whole bunch of rooftop AC units that are getting old. And then if you remember, we also have the roof that's starting to get old. And so that money hopefully will provide enough there. So if you look in total, you can see we had to budget to use $123,500 of fund balance. We're using $85,000 of that for capital type items. So really there's a deficit of about $32,500. And so that's why we're proposing that rent increase to help bring that up. Ideally, this fund would be revenue neutral and would just break even on those rents so that it was self-sustaining, because long term, once that fund balance that we've accumulated from property taxes go away, the city would be on the hook for any of those repairs or ongoing maintenance associated with that facility. So that's the RDA funds in a nutshell and their budgets. So that is all the different funds and departments. I don't know if anybody has any questions for me. I know we've went really fast. I've probably put everybody to sleep. Yep, see, nobody even answered.
Anything else, Cody?
That's all I have, Mayor. We tried to keep the budget, like I said earlier, pretty flat, but address some of those needs. And we would like to start that 2030 deadline. I know that seems like a long ways away, but in legislative years, it's not very far. And so we wanted to do a couple of those things to get the ball rolling a little bit more. And that's all I have.
Mayor, this is Braden. Hey, Cody, I had a question. So with our budget going up to like 13 million, the rainy day fund is based on that budget amount, right? Is it 35% they allow us to do now? So does that allow us to tuck more into that rainy day fund?
It does. It's potentially, as long as we have it left over at the end of the year, we can keep that fund balance at that 35%. So this year we'll have to see how much of a transfer we have to the capital projects fund, because hopefully we have enough left over that we can fully fund that 35% and then send a little bit to the capital projects fund.
Okay.
That's great. Any other questions or comments? I'd like to thank you, Cody, for all you do. Just, I think tonight with all your work and what you put into it, and along with Bill and the department heads, you actually cut about a 4-hour meeting down to about an hour and a half. So, and it's very thorough, and I know you've really given a lot of attention to it, and a lot of time and trying to get things right. A lot of good things included in this year's budget. I think everybody should be happy with that, and pretty excited. You look like you've been whipped, so I'm sure you'll go home and sleep tonight. So that's great. We appreciate all of you involved with this budget. We're glad things are taking a good turn sales tax wise right now. That helps. And as you mentioned, we do have that money coming from the Rescue America Fund. There was an REF or RA. That coming, I guess $63 billion going to all the cities in the state. Another $63 billion going to the state out of that millions, trillions that's being used for different things. But certainly that won't hurt. But there's just a lot of good things happening. But we sincerely appreciate your efforts and the efforts of those that you work with here on the staff. I think anybody would be proud and be pleased to be able to sit and listen to a budget outlook like that. So appreciate all you do. Do you have anything else on, I know there's an item on here, discussion of future budgets and that. I know you touched on some of those things during your presentation. Do you have anything, or Bill wants to add anything to that for now? I know we got some things coming with LYRB with what they're doing, studies for looking at the 2030 cliff that is going to have to be dealt with. So I like the idea of the lobbyists and things of that nature. That may make the difference, if we can do that. If not, we're just going to have to. We got some really good heads, put them together and figure it out. So, you have anything else, Bill?
Yeah, just one comment, if I may. If you notice that there's not any one department in here that represents a very large increase. We're all trying to play it just a little bit tight and close to the vest and running just a little bit scared, and whatever other mixed metaphor you want to throw in there. We're all very concerned about the responsibilities that we have, not only currently for the budget, but also trying to anticipate what's going forward. And so when you mentioned the discussion of future budgets, we're all just really nervous about how this is all going to play out in the next few years. And so when we talk about things going forward, I know that some of us are going to have projects and things that we want to do at the city. We had a resident come and ask about doing a disc golf course. We've got a number of acres here near City Hall that maybe want to be developed into a park going forward. I know Rich has got a million things that he'd like to do, and all of these things are important. Of course, and I say this, I beat this drum constantly, but funding reflects priorities. And so as we go forward with the budgets and with projects and things, we really need to evaluate and keep in mind what our priorities are. As we looked at those charts that Cody put up at the beginning, we see that the bulk of our funding goes to public safety, and that's as it should be. Those are places that can absorb all the money that we can put at them. And I know that both Chief Brinkman and Chief Shawley and all of those guys would be happy to have millions and millions more if we could give it to them, and they could really do some good things with that. So it's important to remember that the priorities are reflected in the funding. And as we go forward with this and the budget changes and adapts and moves, and we have money to put into things or not, we're going to need to make sure that our pencils stay sharp and that we are paying attention to those things. So that's kind of my thought for the evening, I guess.
I
Mayor, I had
appreciate
one thing.
that.
So,
Somebody else have a comment?
yeah, just a quick comment. You had just one piece of kind of semi-decent news. You had asked if anybody had a chance down at the Utah League conference to talk to Ray about his thoughts on the change to the tax structure or tax disbursement. And hopefully, I know I talked to him, and I think Bill talked to him, and I think he's going to get together with you guys. But he felt like that was really not something that was going to happen. And so we might have just a little bit of a breather on that. We still got the 2030 we got to deal with, but hopefully that's something that we can relax from for a little while.
That's great. Yeah, that's good. I heard that Bill said that you guys had some discussions with him, and that's a big deal because there's just, I know this year, I mentioned the end of this session this year that there was a bill by one of the senators that was put on the table that would change the sales tax distribution from 50% point of sale to 50% based on population. So you want to change that to 100% distribution by population, and I think Roger too talked him out of it this year, and so those things are going to come up. So they just kind of keep telling us, don't put all your eggs in one basket, and I think we have to be very, very careful there. So we've been very fortunate. So does anyone have anything else they want to add? We appreciate you all, council, for being here. A fairly long night tonight, and appreciate all you do. And thank you. Thank the staff for their efforts in this budget. So with that, do we have a motion to adjourn the strategic planning meeting?
So moved. This is Councilor Mitchell.
Second, Councilor Ellis.
Okay, second by Councilor Ellis. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? This meeting's adjourned. Thank you for being here. Have a good